December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor lies in ruins, smoke still rising from the shattered remains of America's Pacific Fleet. While the nation reels from the devastating surprise attack, a small group of naval aviators stare at their aircraft with a sinking feeling. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, stubby, barrel-shaped, seemingly outmatched in every way. Within weeks they would face the most feared fighter in the Pacific, the Mitsubishi A6M0, a machine that had swept opposition from the skies over China with contemptuous ease. On paper, the Americans didn't stand a chance. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, could climb higher and faster, and possessed a range that seemed impossible for a carrier fighter. The Wildcat was slower, heavier, climbed like a freight elevator, and turned with all the grace of a dump truck. Japanese pilots, veterans of years of combat in China, looked at intelligence reports of the American fighter and smiled. The Americans, they said, had sent us a gift. But something extraordinary would happen over the next 2 years. These supposedly inferior American fighters would not just survive against the Zero, they would prevail. The exchange ratio would shift from even to decisively in favor of the Wildcats. By the end of 1943, American pilots in their chunky Grummans were shooting down nearly 7 Zeros for every Wildcat lost. This is the story of how industrial pragmatism defeated elegant engineering, how tactical innovation overcame technical superiority, and how American pilots in their rugged Wildcats stood their ground against the Zero and rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. The Grumman F4F Wildcat emerged from the transition between 2 eras of naval aviation. In the mid-1930s, the skies over aircraft carriers were still dominated by biplanes, elegant machines with fixed landing gear and open cockpits. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had built its reputation on these biplanes. The FF, F2F and F3F, stubby little fighters with distinctive retractable landing gear that folded into the fuselage, leaving the wheels partially exposed. When the Navy requested proposals for a new monoplane fighter in 1936, Grumman submitted a design that was essentially their F3F biplane with a single wing. The prototype, designated XF4F1, was a disaster. It couldn't match the performance of competing designs, particularly the Brewster F2A Buffalo. But Grumman's chief engineer, William Schwendler, and project engineer Robert Hall refused to accept defeat. They went back to the drawing board, redesigning the aircraft from the ground up. The XF4F2 that emerged in 1937 was a completely different machine. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp radial engine, producing 1,050 horsepower, it featured a larger wing, improved aerodynamics, and a more powerful armament of 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns. Still, it didn't impress the Navy enough to win the competition. The Brewster Buffalo got the contract, but history has a way of proving first impressions wrong. The Buffalo would go on to become one of the most notorious failures of World War II, while the Wildcat would become legendary. In 1939, after continued development, the Navy finally ordered 54 F4F3 Wildcats. The production aircraft that rolled off Grumman's Long Island factory floor in late 1940 was a compact, solid-looking fighter. It stood on sturdy landing gear that retracted with a hand crank, requiring the pilot to turn a wheel 29 times after takeoff. The fuselage was stubby and wide, housing the 14-cylinder radial engine up front and a single-seat cockpit protected by armor plating behind the pilot. The wings, though short and stubby compared to other fighters, were incredibly strong, built to withstand the brutal stress of carrier landings. Early production F4F3s could reach 331 miles per hour at 21,000 feet, powered by the R1830-76 engine producing 1,200 horsepower. They could climb to 10,000 feet in just under 4.5 minutes and had a service ceiling of 37,000 feet, exceptional for the time. The armament was straightforward but effective. 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 2 in each wing with 450 rounds per gun. Total ammunition load, 1,800 rounds, enough for about 34 seconds of continuous fire. The British Royal Navy, desperate for modern fighters, ordered Wildcats even before the US Navy fully committed to the type. They christened it the Martlet and put it into service in late 1940, where it scored its first combat victory on Christmas Day 1940, shooting down a German Junkers Ju-88 over Scapa Flow. This was the first combat victory by an American-built fighter in British service during World War II. While the Wildcat was still working out its growing pains, across the Pacific, Mitsubishi was creating a legend. The A6M-0 was born from a seemingly impossible set of requirements issued by the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1937. They wanted a carrier-based fighter with a maximum speed over 300 miles per hour, exceptional maneuverability, long range for bomber escort, heavy armament, and the ability to outperform anything in the sky. Most aircraft designers would have laughed at such specifications. You couldn't have all those qualities in a single airframe. The laws of physics demanded compromises. Range meant fuel weight, armor meant more weight, speed meant power, which meant a heavy engine, which meant more weight. To meet the performance requirements, something had to give. Jiro Horikoshi, Mitsubishi's brilliant young chief designer, made a decision that would define the Zero's character throughout the war. He would sacrifice protection for performance. Every ounce of unnecessary weight was stripped away. Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi worked with Sumitomo Metal Industries to develop extra super duralumin, an aluminum alloy that was stronger and lighter than conventional aircraft materials. They used this revolutionary alloy throughout the airframe, creating a structure that was incredibly light but sufficiently strong for carrier operations. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bullet-resistant windscreen. In pursuit of the ultimate fighter, Horikoshi had created a machine that was lethally vulnerable to damage. But in exchange for this vulnerability, he had created something extraordinary. The Zero was powered by a Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine, producing 940 horsepower, significantly less than the Wildcat's engine. Yet despite the power disadvantage, the Zero was faster, with a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour, matching the early Wildcat. More importantly, the lightweight design gave it phenomenal agility. The Zero could turn inside any fighter in the world. Its roll rate was exceptional. Its climb rate was extraordinary, reaching 10,000 feet in just 3.5 minutes, a full minute faster than the Wildcat. The Zero's range was perhaps its most shocking characteristic. With drop tanks, it could fly over 1,900 miles, more than double the Wildcat's range. This meant Zero pilots could escort bombers on missions that American planners considered impossible for single-engine fighters. The armament was formidable for its time. 2 7.7mm machine guns in the nose, and 2 20mm Type 99 cannon in the wings. The cannon, while carrying only 60 rounds each, could destroy an aircraft with a single hit. When the Zero entered service in July 1940 and was deployed to China, it immediately dominated the skies. Chinese pilots in their American-made Curtiss Hawks and Soviet I-15s and I-16s were helpless against this new fighter. In the first month of operations, Zeros shot down 99 Chinese aircraft without a single loss in air combat. The legend was born. By December 1941, the Zero was the standard carrier-based fighter for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its pilots were among the best trained in the world, with many having years of combat experience over China. They had developed tactics specifically suited to the Zero's strengths, using its superior maneuverability to outturn opponents, then finishing them with the deadly 20mm cannon. American intelligence had reports about this new Japanese fighter, but the details seemed exaggerated, impossible. A carrier fighter that could outperform land-based fighters, that had a range of nearly 2,000 miles, that could outmaneuver everything in the sky. It had to be propaganda. Nothing could be that good. They were about to discover how wrong they were. When Japan launched its offensive across the Pacific on December 7th and 8th, 1941, Zeros were everywhere. Over Pearl Harbor, Zeros strafed grounded aircraft and engaged the handful of American fighters that managed to get airborne. The American pilots were shocked by the Zero's performance. It could turn inside the most maneuverable American fighters. It could outclimb them, and it seemed to be flown by pilots who knew exactly what they were doing. Over the Philippines, Zeros massacred American P-40 Warhawks and P-35s. Over Malaya, they swept aside British Brewster Buffaloes and outdated biplanes. And at Wake Island, they would have their first encounter with the Grumman F4F Wildcat. Wake Island was a tiny coral atoll 2,300 miles west of Hawaii, barely visible above the waves of the Pacific. In December 1941, it was defended by 449 Marines, 68 Navy personnel, and nearly 1,200 civilian contractors working to build up the island's facilities. The air defense consisted of 12 F4F-3 Wildcats from Marine Fighting Squadron 211, VMF 211, commanded by Major Paul Putnam. The Wildcats had arrived just days before the war began, flown in from the carrier Enterprise. On December 8th, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 36 Japanese G-3M Nell bombers appeared over Wake Island. The attack came at noon, catching the Marines at lunch. The Wildcats were on the ground, lined up neatly on the airfield. There was no radar, no early warning system. The Japanese bombers had a clear run. In minutes, 7 of the 12 Wildcats were destroyed on the ground, twisted, burning wrecks scattered across the coral airstrip. The 8th was badly damaged but repairable. 23 Marines were killed and 11 wounded. VMF 211 had lost more than half its aircraft and crew in the first minutes of combat. But the 5 remaining Wildcats would write a remarkable chapter in the battle for Wake Island. Captain Henry Elrod, a quiet pilot from Georgia who had played football at the University of Georgia before joining the Marines, would become one of the heroes of Wake's defense. Flying one of the surviving Wildcats, Elrod led the handful of Marine fighters against daily Japanese bombing raids. On December 9th, the Wildcats intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers. Elrod shot down 2 of them, demonstrating that the Wildcat properly flown could match the Japanese aircraft. But it was on December 11th that the Wildcats and their pilots truly distinguished themselves. A Japanese invasion force approached Wake Island that morning, consisting of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and transports carrying 450 Special Naval Landing Force troops. The Marines on the ground waited until the ships were close, then opened fire with their coastal artillery. The Japanese were caught by surprise. The Marines hit the light cruiser Yubari and several other ships. Then the 4 remaining flyable Wildcats took off. Captain Elrod, flying his jury-rigged fighter with makeshift repairs, attacked the destroyer Kisaragi with 100-pound bombs. It was an almost impossible shot. A small bomb dropped from a fighter plane against a maneuvering warship, but Elrod's bomb struck the Kisaragi near the stern, detonating the destroyer's depth charges. The ship erupted in a massive explosion and sank with all hands. Henry Elrod had become the first American pilot to sink a warship with small bombs delivered by a fighter plane in World War II. The Japanese invasion force, shocked by the ferocity of the defense, withdrew. Wake Island had repelled an amphibious assault, a feat that would not be repeated by American forces for years. The Wildcats continued fighting for another 12 days, flying against daily bombing raids by Japanese medium bombers, and increasingly by Zeros from the carriers Hiryu and Soryu, which had been diverted from returning home after the Pearl Harbor attack. The Marine pilots discovered what Chinese pilots had learned years before. In a turning fight, the Zero was untouchable. Captain Elrod tried to dogfight with the Zero, and found his Wildcat couldn't turn quickly enough to get his guns on target. The Zero simply turned inside him, forcing Elrod to break off and dive away. But the Marines also made a crucial discovery. The Wildcat was tough. One of the fighters took hits from multiple 20mm cannon shells and kept flying. The heavy armor behind the pilot's seat stopped bullets that would have killed pilots in less protected fighters. The self-sealing fuel tanks, filled with a layer of rubber that swelled when punctured, prevented fuel fires that had doomed so many aircraft in earlier wars. When Wake Island finally fell on December 23rd, with the pilots fighting as infantry after their last aircraft was destroyed, Captain Elrod was killed in hand-to-hand combat defending his position on the beach. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The defense of Wake Island had lasted 15 days. 4 Wildcats had fought against overwhelming odds and had sunk a destroyer, shot down multiple Japanese aircraft, and proved that American pilots and American fighters could fight back. But Wake was an isolated incident, a brief moment of resistance in an otherwise catastrophic series of defeats. In the weeks and months after Pearl Harbor, American forces retreated across the Pacific. The Philippines fell, Malaya fell. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered. The Dutch East Indies were overrun, Hong Kong, Wake, Guam, all captured, and everywhere the Zero dominated the skies. In the battles of early 1942, the few American carriers operating in the Pacific launched their Wildcats against Japanese forces, and the results were sobering. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Wildcats from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown faced Zeros for the first time in sustained carrier-versus-carrier combat. The American pilots were shocked by what they encountered. The Zero could outturn them with ease, it could outclimb them, it had a better rate of roll. In individual dogfights, Zero pilots consistently got the better of Wildcat pilots. Lieutenant Commander John Thach, commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3 aboard the Lexington, was one of the Navy's most experienced fighter pilots and a brilliant tactician. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, he submitted a report that pulled no punches. The F4F airplane is pitifully inferior in climb, maneuverability and speed, Thach wrote. Any success our fighter pilots may have had against the Japanese Zero fighter is not due to the performance of the airplane we fly, but is the result of the comparatively poor marksmanship of the Japanese, stupid mistakes made by a few of their pilots, and superior marksmanship and teamwork of some of our pilots. It was a brutal assessment, but Thach wasn't giving up. He had already been working on a solution to the Zero problem for months. In September 1941, Thach had received an intelligence report from China detailing the Zero's extraordinary performance. The report indicated a climb rate of 5,000 feet per minute, exceptional maneuverability, and a small turning radius. Thach, based at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, spent his evenings working on the problem. He would sit at his kitchen table in nearby Coronado, California, using matchsticks to represent aircraft. He moved them around the table, simulating combat scenarios, trying to find a formation and tactic that would allow the slower Wildcats to survive and fight effectively against the more agile Zeros. The standard fighter formation of the era used 3 aircraft. Thach hated it. It was too rigid, and it left the trailing aircraft vulnerable. He experimented with 2 plane sections, what would later become standard in all air forces. Working late into the night, Thach eventually developed what he called the beam defense position. The theory was simple but revolutionary. 2 Wildcats would fly side by side, separated by the tactical diameter of the aircraft, meaning the distance of the tightest circle a Wildcat could make. When an enemy fighter attacked one Wildcat, that pilot would turn toward his wingman. The 2 aircraft would cross paths. If the enemy took the bait and followed the first Wildcat, he would find himself flying head-on toward the second Wildcat, who would be in perfect position to fire. Then the 2 Wildcats would separate again and repeat the maneuver, continuously weaving back and forth. Thach called on Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare, who led the second section in Thach's division, to help test the idea. Thach took off with 3 other Wildcats in the role of defenders. O'Hare led 4 Wildcats playing the role of attackers. In a series of simulated attacks, O'Hare found that in every instance, Thach's fighters had either ruined his attack or actually maneuvered into position to shoot back. After landing, O'Hare was excited. "Skipper, it really worked," he told Thach. "I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." The Thach Weave, as it would become known, was born. But Thach hadn't had a chance to test it in actual combat yet. That opportunity would come at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Before that, however, another event would boost American morale and prove that the Wildcat, in the hands of a skilled pilot, could be deadly. February 20th, 1942. The aircraft carrier. Lexington, Task Force 11, was operating north of New Ireland near Bougainville, preparing to strike the Japanese base at Rabaul. At 3:42 in the afternoon, the Lexington's radar picked up an unknown contact 47 miles to the west. Minutes later, multiple formations of Japanese aircraft were detected approaching from different directions. The carrier launched every available fighter. By 4:05 p.m., only 2 Wildcats remained to defend the ship, flown by Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare and his wingman, Lieutenant Marion Duff Dufilo. Then radar detected another formation, 9 twin-engine bombers, closing fast from only 12 miles out. O'Hare and Dufilo scrambled, their Wildcats clawing for altitude. They intercepted the formation of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers at 1,500 feet, just 9 miles from the Lexington. Then disaster struck. Dufilo's guns jammed. He was helpless. Only O'Hare and his 450 caliber machine guns stood between 9 Japanese bombers and the Lady Lex. What happened next would make Butch O'Hare the first American ace of World War II and the first naval aviator to receive the Medal of Honor. O'Hare attacked alone. He dove on the Japanese formation from above and to the side, a deflection shot that required leading the target. His first burst hit a Betty, which immediately burst into flames and fell away. He came around for another pass from the opposite side, selecting another bomber. More precise bursts. Another Betty exploded. Lieutenant Commander John Thach, flying his own Wildcat several miles away, watched 3 flaming Japanese planes in the air at the same time. O'Hare was systematically destroying the formation. He attacked again and again using short, precise bursts. His gunnery training under Thach's tutelage was paying off. Each burst was economical, each shot calculated. The Betty bombers, loaded with torpedoes for their attack on the Lexington, were extremely vulnerable to the heavy .50 caliber bullets. The Wildcat's guns, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, punched through the bomber's thin skin and ignited fuel tanks and bomb bays. By the time the attack was over, O'Hare had shot down 5 Betty bombers and damaged a 6th. The remaining bombers, their formation shattered, turned away without attacking the Lexington. O'Hare landed back on the carrier, his Wildcat having taken only a single bullet hole. The ammunition counters showed he had used approximately 60 rounds per aircraft shot down, remarkably efficient shooting in aerial combat. When he climbed out of his cockpit, one of the Lexington's gunners approached him, embarrassed. The gunner had fired at O'Hare as he approached the carrier for landing, mistaking him for an enemy aircraft. O'Hare looked at the young sailor and said, "Son, if you don't stop shooting at me when I've got my wheels down, I'm going to report you to the gunnery officer." The quip became famous throughout the fleet. On April 21, 1942, at a White House ceremony, President Franklin Roosevelt presented O'Hare with the Medal of Honor. His wife Rita draped the medal around his neck as Roosevelt looked on. O'Hare was promoted to lieutenant commander. For a nation reeling from defeat after defeat in the Pacific, Butch O'Hare's victory was a desperately needed morale boost. It proved that American pilots could fight back, that the Japanese were not invincible, and that the Wildcat, properly handled, was a deadly weapon. But individual heroics, however inspiring, couldn't change the fundamental equation. The Zero was still superior to the Wildcat in most performance parameters. American pilots needed more than courage and good gunnery. They needed tactics that would neutralize the Zero's advantages. The Battle of Midway would provide the first real test of those tactics. June 4, 1942, the Japanese combined fleet, under Admiral Yamamoto, was converging on Midway Island with the intent to destroy what remained of the American Pacific Fleet and capture the strategic atoll. Admiral Chester Nimitz, warned by intelligence that had broken the Japanese naval codes, had positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown, northeast of Midway in ambush positions. The American carriers launched their strike aircraft in the early morning hours. The results were initially catastrophic. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet attacked the Japanese carriers and was annihilated. All 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown fared no better. Of 12 Devastators that attacked, 10 were shot down. Escorting these doomed torpedo bombers was a division of 6 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3, led by Lieutenant Commander John Thach. This would be the combat debut of the Thach Weave. As the Devastators made their low-level attack runs against the Japanese carriers, they were swarmed by 15 to 20 Zeros. Thach's 6 Wildcats were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. The Zeros attacked with confidence, diving on the Wildcats from above. Thach ordered his pilots into the Weave. The Wildcats turned toward each other, crossing paths as they had practiced. A Zero pilot, intent on shooting down Thach's wingman, Ensign Robert Ram Dibb, followed him into the Weave. As Dibb turned toward Thach, the Zero pilot suddenly found himself head-on with Thach's Wildcat. Thach opened fire, his tracers walking up the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter's engine burst into flames. The Zero tumbled into the Pacific Ocean. The maneuver had worked exactly as designed. Again and again, the Zeros tried to attack Thach's formation. Each time, they found themselves flying into the teeth of another Wildcat's guns. Ensign Tom Cheek, flying in the second section, shot down a Zero that was attacking the torpedo bombers. He maneuvered to attack 2 more Zeros, forcing them to break off their attacks. By the end of the engagement, Thach's division had shot down at least 4 Zeros, possibly more, and lost only 1 Wildcat. Thach himself shot down 3 Japanese fighters. The Thach Weave had proven itself in combat. Word spread through the fleet. Here was a tactic that allowed the supposedly inferior Wildcats to not just survive against Zeros, but to shoot them down. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who had watched Thach's demonstration of the maneuver before Midway, used it successfully at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942. Leading a division of 4 Wildcats against attacking Zeros, The Japanese pilots were confounded. They were accustomed to enemies trying to turn with them, trying to outmaneuver them. That never worked. The Zero always won turning fights. But these Americans weren't trying to outturn the Zeros. They were using teamwork and mutual support to create situations where the Zeros couldn't use their maneuverability advantage. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the most successful fighter pilots of the war, encountered the Thach Weave over Guadalcanal and described his frustration. 2 Wildcats jumped on Commander Nakajima's plane, Sakai wrote. He had no trouble getting on the tail of an enemy fighter, but never had a chance to fire before the Grumman's teammate roared at him from the side. Nakajima was forced to dive and run for safety. The commander was raging when he got back to Rabaul. The maneuver proved so effective that it was adopted not just by Navy and Marine Wildcat pilots, but by Army Air Force pilots, and even by pilots in other air forces. It would be used throughout World War II and beyond, remaining a viable defensive tactic even into the Jet Age and Vietnam War. But the Thach Weave wasn't the only tactical innovation American pilots developed. They also discovered and exploited other characteristics of the Wildcat that, while not as flashy as speed or maneuverability, were just as important in combat. The Wildcat could dive faster than the Zero. The Zero's lightweight construction, while giving it phenomenal maneuverability, made it structurally weak at high speeds. Above 300 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became heavy and sluggish. The ailerons, used for rolling, became almost impossible to move. A Zero pilot trying to maneuver at high speed would find his fighter unresponsive, wallowing through the air. The Wildcat, built like a tank with heavy gauge metal and robust construction, could dive much faster. Wildcat pilots learned to use this advantage. Instead of trying to turn with Zeros, they would make slashing attacks, diving from above, firing a burst, then using their speed to zoom back up to altitude or escape. The tactic became known as boom and zoom. Dive, shoot, climb away. Never turn with a Zero. Never try to dogfight. Use speed and altitude. By late 1942, these tactics were being taught to every new Wildcat pilot. The aircraft that had been written off as inferior was proving to be a survivor. Another critical advantage was the Wildcat's toughness. The Grumman Iron Works, as the company was nicknamed, built aircraft that could take incredible punishment and keep flying. The Wildcat had armor plate behind the pilot's seat, 3/8 of an inch of steel that would stop rifle-caliber bullets, and even some cannon shells. The windscreen was bulletproof glass, 1/2 an inch thick. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, with multiple layers of rubber that swelled when punctured, preventing fuel from leaking and catching fire. The radial engine, while not as powerful as later American engines, was incredibly reliable and could run even with several cylinders shot out. There was no liquid cooling system to be punctured, no radiator to spring a leak. As long as the engine wasn't hit directly in critical components, it would keep running. Wildcats would return from missions with dozens of bullet holes, with damaged control surfaces, with hydraulic systems shot out. They would land safely, be repaired, and fly again the next day. Zeros, by contrast, were fragile. A single .50 caliber round in the fuel tank would often cause a catastrophic fire. Hits in the wing spar could cause structural failure. The lightweight construction that made them so maneuverable also made them vulnerable. American pilots learned to aim for the Zero's vulnerable points, the wing route where the wing joined the fuselage, where the fuel tanks were located, the engine, which had no armor protection. A short burst from 450 caliber machine guns was often enough to set a Zero ablaze. The statistics began to shift. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, the exchange ratio between Wildcats and Zeros was roughly even. 14 Zeros shot down for 10 Wildcats lost. By the Battle of Midway, it was improving. By the battles over Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943, the ratio had shifted decisively in favour of the Americans. Marine Wildcats operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal were shooting down nearly 6 Zeros for every Wildcat lost. Part of this shift was tactical. American pilots were learning how to fight Zeros effectively. But another part was training. The United States was producing pilots at an unprecedented rate. By 1942, the American pilot training program was graduating thousands of pilots annually. Each pilot received extensive training before entering combat. Flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola included hundreds of hours of flying time, gunnery practice, aerobatics, formation flying, instrument flying, and carrier qualifications. By the time a Navy or Marine pilot reached the fleet, he had flown 200 to 400 hours and was thoroughly familiar with his aircraft. The Japanese, by contrast, had started the war with superbly trained pilots, many with years of combat experience over China. But as the war progressed and these veterans were killed, the Japanese training program couldn't replace them with equally skilled pilots. Japanese pilot training was shortened to meet demand. New pilots entered combat with less than 100 hours of flight time. They lacked the gunnery skills, the tactical knowledge, and the experience of their predecessors. Compounding this problem was the Japanese practice of keeping their best pilots in combat continuously until they were killed. The Americans, conversely, rotated combat veterans back to training commands where they could pass their knowledge to the next generation of pilots. Lieutenant Commander Thach, after his successes at Midway, was pulled from combat and assigned to train other pilots in fighter tactics. His experience and his Thach Weave maneuver were shared with thousands of new pilots. This difference in training philosophy would prove decisive as the war progressed. American pilots arrived at their squadrons well trained and ready for combat. Japanese pilots arrived increasingly unprepared and were quickly shot down by the better trained Americans. By mid-1943, even average American pilots in Wildcats were consistently outfighting Japanese pilots in Zeros. The final factor in the Wildcat's success was American industrial capacity. Grumman's factory on Long Island was producing Wildcats at an accelerating rate. When demand exceeded Grumman's capacity, General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division began building Wildcats under license at a massive new plant in New Jersey. By 1943, Wildcats were being produced at a rate of hundreds per month. The Japanese, meanwhile, were struggling to replace their losses. Mitsubishi's factories, while efficient, couldn't match American production rates. More critically, they couldn't replace the trained pilots. A shot-down Zero pilot represented years of training lost. A shot-down American pilot, if he survived, would be rescued, sent back to the States to recover, then returned to training command or back to combat. The mathematics were inexorable. America could afford to lose aircraft and pilots and replace them quickly. Japan could not. In April 1943, Admiral Yamamoto was killed when his transport aircraft was intercepted and shot down by Army Air Force P-38 Lightnings. The architect of Pearl Harbor, Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, was gone. His death was symbolic of the shift in the Pacific War. The initiative had passed to the Americans. By late 1943, new American fighters were arriving in the Pacific. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, essentially a larger, more powerful Wildcat, began replacing FFs on fleet carriers. The Chance-Vought F-4U Corsair, a gull-winged beast with 2,000 horsepower, was entering service with Marine squadrons. Both aircraft were superior to the Zero in virtually every performance parameter. They were faster, could outclimb the Zero, could outdive it, had better armament, and were even more rugged than the Wildcat. But the Wildcat wasn't retired. It continued serving throughout the war on escort carriers, small carriers that couldn't handle the larger, heavier Hellcats and Corsairs. On these escort carriers, Wildcats provided air defense for convoys, hunted submarines, and supported amphibious landings. The improved FM2 variant, built by General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division, had a more powerful engine, lighter weight, and better climb performance. The FM2 was specifically designed for escort carrier operations and proved highly effective. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Wildcats from escort carriers of Taffy 3 helped fight off a Japanese surface force that included battleships and heavy cruisers. The Wildcats strafed Japanese ships, made dummy bombing runs to disrupt their formations, and helped buy time for the vulnerable escort carriers to escape. It was a far cry from the dark days of early 1942, when Wildcat pilots wondered if their aircraft could even survive against the Zero. By the end of World War II, the Wildcat's combat record was impressive. Navy and Marine Wildcats and FM2s flew over 15,500 combat sorties and were credited with destroying 1,327 enemy aircraft. The final kill-to-loss ratio was 6.9 to 1, nearly 7 Japanese aircraft shot down for every Wildcat lost in combat. For an aircraft that was supposedly inferior to its primary opponent, these were remarkable statistics. The Wildcat also served with distinction in other theatres. In the Atlantic, Wildcats flying from escort carriers hunted German U-boats and provided air cover for convoys. They flew from small carriers in the Mediterranean, supporting the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. British Wildcats, still called Martlets in British service until 1944, flew from escort carriers protecting Arctic convoys to Russia, some of the most dangerous flying in the war. On May 5, 1945, Wildcats flew the last Allied air raid of the war in Europe, attacking a U-boat base in Norway. But it was in the Pacific that the Wildcat earned its immortality: Wake Island, the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal. The names of these battles are forever linked with the stubby Grumman fighter. At Guadalcanal, Marine Captain Joe Foss flew a Wildcat and shot down 26 Japanese aircraft in 4 months, becoming one of the top American aces of the war. He received the Medal of Honor. Major Marion Carl, another Marine Wildcat ace, shot down 18.5 Japanese aircraft. Major John L. Smith shot down 19. These men and hundreds of others proved that in the hands of a skilled, well-trained pilot using proper tactics, the Wildcat was a match for any fighter in the world. The story of the Wildcat versus the Zero is ultimately a story about the difference between fighting the war you planned for and fighting the war you're in. The Japanese had created the Zero as the perfect embodiment of their tactical and strategic philosophy. Maneuverability above all, offense over defense, the purity of the warrior spirit combined with technical excellence. It was a beautiful philosophy, and it created a beautiful aircraft. But it was a philosophy suited to short, decisive campaigns, not a long war of attrition. The Americans had created the Wildcat out of pragmatism. It wasn't the fastest fighter, it wasn't the most maneuverable, but it was tough, reliable, easy to produce, and forgiving of pilot error. And when American pilots discovered they couldn't outturn the Zero, they didn't despair. They adapted. They developed new tactics. They exploited the Wildcat's strengths and avoided its weaknesses. The Thach Weave, boom and zoom tactics, emphasis on teamwork and mutual support, all of these were innovations born of necessity. American pilots weren't better than Japanese pilots, at least not initially. Japanese pilots in 1942 had more experience, better training, and years of combat behind them. But the American system, the training pipeline that produced pilot after pilot, the industrial capacity that replaced losses within weeks, the tactical flexibility that allowed new methods to be adopted quickly, this system proved superior to individual excellence. By 1943, the average American pilot was better trained than the average Japanese pilot. By 1944, the gap had widened to a chasm. New Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with minimal training, flying inferior or worn-out aircraft, facing American pilots who had 400 hours of flight training in modern fighters. The outcome was foreordained. The Zero, that elegant embodiment of Japanese philosophy, became a death trap for inexperienced pilots. Its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that any hit could be fatal. Its lightweight construction, designed for maneuverability, made it structurally fragile. And as American pilots became more skilled and American fighters became more powerful, the Zero's advantages evaporated. The Wildcat, derided as a flying beer barrel, as a stubby little barrel-shaped fighter that couldn't turn with the Zero, proved to be exactly what the United States Navy needed. It was rugged enough to absorb battle damage and bring its pilot home. It was simple enough to be produced in large numbers. It was forgiving enough that pilots with only 200 hours of training could fly it safely. And in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was deadly. When historians assess the aircraft of World War II, they often focus on performance statistics: maximum speed, rate of climb, service ceiling, maneuverability. By these metrics, the Wildcat was inferior to the Zero, but war isn't fought on paper, it's fought by young men in dangerous machines over hostile territory, and in that environment, the Wildcat's less flashy virtues, toughness, reliability, ease of production, forgiveness, proved more valuable than pure performance. The Wildcat stood its ground against the Zero and prevailed not because it was a better aircraft in the traditional sense, but because it was a better aircraft for the kind of war America had to fight. A long war of attrition where production capacity, pilot training, and tactical flexibility mattered more than individual aircraft performance. In the end, the Zero's reign as the dominant fighter in the Pacific lasted less than a year. From December 1941 to late 1942, it was the king of the skies. But by 1943, American pilots in Wildcats were shooting down Zeros with regularity. By 1944, with Hellcats and Corsairs entering service, the Zero was hopelessly outclassed. The aircraft that had seemed invincible in 1941 was obsolete by 1944. The Wildcat, by contrast, remained in production and in combat service throughout the entire war. The last Wildcat rolled off the assembly line in August 1945, just weeks before Japan surrendered. In total, 7,185 Wildcats of all variants were produced. They served in the US Navy, the US Marine Corps, the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and with other Allied forces. Today, you can see restored Wildcats in museums across the United States. There's one at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, painted in the colours of Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare's aircraft from that February day in 1942 when he single-handedly defended the Lexington. There's another at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and there are others at smaller museums and in private collections maintained by enthusiasts who understand the Wildcat's place in history. These surviving aircraft, with their stubby fuselages and wide radial engines, might not look particularly impressive next to sleek modern jets. But they represent something important. They represent the moment when American naval aviation came of age, when American pilots discovered that they could fight and win against an enemy that seemed unbeatable, when tactics and teamwork proved more important than pure performance, when industrial might backed by skilled workers and brave pilots turned the tide of the Pacific War. The day the F4F Wildcat stood its ground against the Zero wasn't really a single day. It was hundreds of days over 2 years, from Wake Island in December 1941 to the skies over Guadalcanal in late 1943. It was every mission where a Wildcat pilot held his formation instead of running. Every engagement where the Thach Weave turned a Zero's attack into the attacker's death. Every pilot who brought his shot-up Wildcat home despite damage that would have destroyed any other fighter. It was Major Paul Putnam's Marines at Wake Island, fighting until their aircraft were destroyed, and then fighting on as infantry. It was Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare over the Lexington, alone against 9 bombers, calmly shooting down 5 of them. It was Lieutenant Commander John Thach at Midway, proving that tactics and teamwork could defeat superior individual performance. It was Captain Joe Foss over Guadalcanal, shooting down 26 Japanese aircraft in 4 months. It was thousands of pilots whose names are forgotten, who flew their Wildcats from carrier decks and remote island airfields, who faced the Zero and refused to back down. The Wildcat's victory over the Zero was America's victory over Japan in miniature. It wasn't won by having better individual warriors or more elegant weapons. It was won by having a better system, better training, better logistics, better production, better tactics, the ability to learn from mistakes and adapt, the willingness to use teamwork instead of relying on individual heroics, and the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. In December 1941, Japanese pilots looked at the stubby American Wildcats and smiled. Easy victories, they thought. Just another obstacle to be swept aside on the road to Japanese dominance of the Pacific. But those stubby Wildcats, flown by determined pilots who refused to accept defeat, stood their ground. And in standing their ground, they helped turn the tide of the greatest war in history. The F4F Wildcat wasn't the best fighter of World War II. It wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable or the most powerful. But it was there when America needed it most, and it did the job it was designed to do. It kept American carriers safe. It defended American forces on the ground. It shot down Japanese aircraft in numbers that seemed impossible given its supposed inferiority. And it bought time for America's industrial might to gear up and produce the next generation of fighters that would sweep the Japanese from the skies. That stubby, barrel-shaped, supposedly inferior fighter earned its place in history. The day the F4F Wildcat stood its ground against the Zero, America's fortunes in the Pacific War began to change, and they never looked back. The transformation of American fighter tactics between 1942 and 1943 went far beyond just the Thach Weave. Marine and Navy pilots fighting from Guadalcanal's Henderson Field developed an entire doctrine of Wildcat employment that would become standard throughout the Pacific Fleet. These men, living in mud, fighting malaria and dysentery, flying aircraft held together with salvaged parts and ingenuity, became the laboratory for American fighter tactics against the Zero. Henderson Field, captured from the Japanese in August 1942, was barely worthy of the name airfield. It was a dirt strip carved out of the jungle, constantly under bombardment from Japanese artillery and naval gunfire. The Wildcats operating from Henderson, primarily from Marine Fighting Squadron 203, VMF 223, and later VMF 224, faced impossible odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned in terms of overall forces, and operating under conditions that would have broken lesser men. But these Marines discovered something crucial about fighting Zeros. Altitude was everything. The Wildcat, despite its inferior climb rate, could reach altitudes where it actually had advantages over the Zero. Above 20,000 feet, the Zero's performance began to degrade. Its engine, optimized for lower altitudes, lost power in the thin air. The controls became mushier. The rate of climb dropped off dramatically. The Wildcat, meanwhile, maintained relatively consistent performance up to its service ceiling of 37,000 feet. Major John Smith, commanding VMF 223, developed a standard operating procedure that became known as the Cactus Fighter Doctrine, named after the code name for Guadalcanal. His pilots would take off from Henderson with as much advance warning as possible, usually alerted by coast watchers, brave Australian and indigenous scouts positioned on islands throughout the Solomons, who radioed warnings of approaching Japanese aircraft. The Wildcats would climb to 25,000 or 30,000 feet, positioning themselves above the incoming Japanese formations. Then they would attack, diving through the Japanese formation at high speed, firing short bursts, then using their speed to zoom back up to altitude. If Zeros gave chase, the Wildcats would simply outdive them. The Japanese fighters couldn't follow without risking structural damage from excessive speed. This tactic required discipline. It required pilots to resist the temptation to mix it up with Zeros in turning fights. It required patience to climb to altitude before attacking instead of rushing into combat. But it worked. Smith himself shot down 19 Japanese aircraft using these tactics before being rotated home. His pilots accounted for dozens more. The lessons learned over Guadalcanal spread throughout the fleet. Fighter directors on carriers began positioning Wildcats at high altitude before combat. Pilots were drilled endlessly on the importance of maintaining altitude advantage. Never get low and slow with Zeros became a mantra repeated in every fighter briefing. Another critical innovation came from studying gun camera footage. Every Wildcat was equipped with a camera synchronized to the guns that recorded each combat engagement. After missions, intelligence officers would study this footage frame by frame, analyzing what worked and what didn't. They discovered that most pilots were shooting from too far away. The 50 caliber machine guns were effective weapons, but their effective range in aerial combat was much shorter than pilots thought. Bullets fired at 600 or 800 yards would be dispersed over a wide area by the time they reached the target. Deflection shooting, leading a target that was turning or climbing, was even harder at long range. The answer was to get close, very close. Hold fire until 300 yards, the instructors taught. Better yet, 200 yards. Fill your windscreen with the target, then fire. Short bursts, 2 or 3 seconds maximum. Watch your tracers. If you're missing, adjust and fire again. This emphasis on marksmanship training paid enormous dividends. American pilots became extremely proficient at gunnery. They practiced against towed targets until they could consistently hit them. They studied deflection shooting, learning to lead targets by the right amount. They learned to estimate range by the apparent size of the target in their gun sight. Japanese pilot training, conversely, included relatively little gunnery practice. Ammunition was precious, and the Japanese couldn't afford to expend it on training. New Japanese pilots arrived at combat units having fired perhaps a few dozen rounds in practice. American pilots arrived having fired thousands of rounds. The difference showed in combat. American pilots consistently achieved higher hit rates than their Japanese counterparts. Another advantage that became apparent as the war progressed was radio communication. Every Wildcat was equipped with a VHF radio that allowed clear communication between aircraft and with ground controllers or carrier fighter directors. American pilots flew in formations where everyone could talk to everyone else. They could warn each other of threats, coordinate attacks, call for help. The Japanese had radios in their aircraft, but the quality was poor. Japanese radios were unreliable, had limited range, and suffered from constant static and interference. More critically, Japanese tactical doctrine didn't emphasize radio communication the way American doctrine did. Japanese pilots flew in tight formations following their leader, relying on visual signals rather than radio calls. This meant that Japanese formations were less flexible, less able to adapt to changing situations. An American formation that spotted Japanese aircraft could immediately coordinate an attack, with the leader assigning targets and positioning aircraft for maximum advantage. A Japanese formation relied on the leader seeing the threat and signalling his intentions through wing rocks or other visual cues, a slower and less precise method. As the Guadalcanal campaign dragged on through late 1942, the attrition on both sides was horrific. But the Americans could replace their losses. Damaged Wildcats were repaired, often with parts cannibalized from other aircraft. Pilots who were shot down over friendly territory or rescued from the ocean after ditching at sea returned to combat. New aircraft arrived on escort carriers. New pilots flew in from rear area bases. The Japanese had no such luxury. Every Zero lost was gone forever. Replacement aircraft had to be flown down from Rabaul, a long and dangerous journey. Pilots shot down over Guadalcanal were lost, either killed or captured. The Japanese pilot force, that superbly trained group that had started the war, was being ground down in a battle of attrition they couldn't win. By February 1943, when the Japanese finally evacuated Guadalcanal, the balance had shifted irrevocably. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. The Zero, once feared as an unbeatable superweapon, was now known to be a fragile aircraft that could be defeated by proper tactics. And the Wildcat, once dismissed as inferior, had proven to be a war winner in the hands of well-trained, aggressive pilots. But even as the tactical situation improved, Wildcat pilots knew they were flying an aircraft that was being surpassed by newer designs. The Zero itself had been upgraded to the A6M3 and A6M5 variants with improved engines and armament. More concerning were reports of new Japanese fighters entering service, aircraft designed to counter American tactics. The Kawanishi N1K Shiden, called George by the Allies, was a land-based fighter with performance comparable to late-war American types. The Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, called Jack, was a heavily armed interceptor designed specifically to destroy American bombers. Against these newer, more powerful Japanese fighters, the Wildcat would have struggled. Fortunately, the Grumman ironworks had not been idle. Even as Wildcats were fighting over Guadalcanal, Grumman engineers were designing the Wildcat's successor. The XF-6F Hellcat prototype first flew in June 1942, just weeks after the Battle of Midway. It was essentially a Wildcat scaled up and powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, twice the power of the Wildcat's engine. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero, could outclimb it, could outdive it, and was even more rugged than the Wildcat. It retained the Wildcat's excellent visibility, its strong landing gear for carrier operations, its reliable systems. But it added speed and climb rate that put it on par with or superior to any Japanese fighter. The Hellcat began entering fleet service in early 1943. By the end of 1943, Hellcats were replacing Wildcats on fleet carriers throughout the Pacific. But there was one problem. The Hellcat was too big and too heavy for escort carriers. The small carriers converted from merchant ship hulls that were being produced by the dozens to provide air cover for convoys and amphibious operations. These escort carriers, affectionately nicknamed jeep carriers or baby flat tops, had shorter flight decks and less powerful catapults than fleet carriers. They needed a fighter that was lighter and had better low-speed handling than the Hellcat. The answer was an improved Wildcat. General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division, which had been producing F4F Wildcats under license, developed the FM2 variant specifically for escort carriers. The FM2 took the basic Wildcat design and refined it. The engine was changed to a Wright R1820 Cyclone producing 1,350 horsepower, more power than the original Wildcat, but in a lighter package than the Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp. The airframe was lightened by reducing fuel capacity and removing some equipment. The vertical tail was enlarged to improve directional stability. The result was a Wildcat that was 500 pounds lighter than the F4F4, had better climb performance, better acceleration, and better handling at low speeds. It was perfect for escort carrier operations. The FM2 entered service in late 1943 and quickly proved its worth. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the largest carrier battle of the war, FM2s flying from escort carriers shot down numerous Japanese aircraft while defending against massive Japanese air attacks. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, FM-2s from escort carriers of Taffy 3 found themselves in an impossible situation. A Japanese surface force consisting of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers had surprised the escort carriers at dawn. The jeep carriers, small and slow, armed only with a single 5-inch gun, and carrying aircraft designed for anti-submarine warfare and ground attack, were facing the most powerful surface force the Japanese had assembled since Midway. The escort carriers fled south at their maximum speed of 18 knots, while their aircraft launched to attack the Japanese fleet. Among these aircraft were the FM-2 Wildcats of Composite Squadron 10, VC-10, from the escort carrier Gambier Bay. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, commanding VC-10's fighters, led his FM-2s in repeated attacks against the Japanese battleships and cruisers. The Wildcats, armed only with their 50 caliber machine guns and small bombs, couldn't sink battleships, but they could harass them, disrupt their formations, and most critically make them maneuver to avoid attacks, slowing their pursuit of the carriers. The Wildcat pilots made strafing runs against the bridge structures of battleships, trying to kill or wound the officers directing the battle. They dropped small bombs that wouldn't penetrate armor, but would damage lighter structures. They made dummy runs with no bombs at all, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver. For 2.5 hours, the pilots of Taffy 3's escort carriers, flying FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, attacked the Japanese fleet continuously. They flew sortie after sortie, landing on any available carrier to rearm, then taking off again to attack. The Japanese fleet, confused by the ferocity of the defense and convinced they were facing fleet carriers rather than escort carriers, eventually broke off the attack and withdrew. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was sunk, the only American carrier lost to surface gunfire in the war, and 2 destroyers and a destroyer escort were also lost. But the other carriers escaped. The FM-2 Wildcats had helped save the day. It was the final validation of the Wildcats' design philosophy. Toughness, reliability, and the courage of the pilots flying them could accomplish seemingly impossible missions. As 1944 turned to 1945, Wildcats continued serving on escort carriers in both the Pacific and Atlantic. In the Atlantic, they hunted German U-boats. The FM-2's ability to carry rockets and depth charges, combined with a long loiter time, made it an excellent anti-submarine aircraft. Wildcats from escort carriers sank numerous U-boats and drove many others away from convoys. In the Pacific, they supported the island-hopping campaign, providing close air support for Marines and Army troops fighting their way across the Central Pacific. They flew from escort carriers off Iwo Jima and Okinawa, some of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. The pilots flying these missions were mostly young men who had never known peacetime flying. They had been trained in the massive American pilot training program, graduated and sent to war. Many were 19 or 20 years old. They flew their Wildcats with a professionalism and skill that would have astonished the pre-war Navy. At Okinawa, FM-2 Wildcats faced a new and terrifying threat: kamikazes. Japanese pilots, often poorly trained and flying obsolete aircraft, were deliberately crashing their planes into American ships. The FM-2 pilots found themselves flying combat air patrol for hours at a time, intercepting kamikaze raids before they could reach the fleet. The FM-2's excellent low-altitude performance made it ideal for this mission. Kamikazes typically attacked at low altitude, hoping to avoid radar detection. FM-2 pilots, directed by radar controllers on picket destroyers, would intercept the kamikazes at low altitude and shoot them down before they could reach their targets. Lieutenant Kenneth Huntington, flying an FM-2 from the escort carrier Tulagi, shot down 4 kamikazes in a single mission on April 17, 1945. His combat report described aircraft coming in from multiple directions, some flying just above the wavetops, others slightly higher. Huntington and his wingman dove on the formations repeatedly, shooting down kamikaze after kamikaze. When they finally landed back on the Tulagi, Huntington's FM-2 had only 20 rounds of ammunition remaining. The grim mathematics of the kamikaze campaign showed the FM-2's effectiveness. Approximately 4,000 kamikaze sorties were flown against American ships during the Okinawa campaign. About half were shot down by combat air patrol fighters before reaching the fleet. The FM-2 Wildcat, the final evolution of the Tubby fighter that had fought at Wake Island and Midway, was still protecting American forces in the war's final battles. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, there were still hundreds of Wildcats in service. Production of the FM-2 continued until August, with the final aircraft delivered just days before the surrender. These last Wildcats never saw combat. The war they had been built to fight was over. In the immediate post-war years, Wildcats were rapidly retired from frontline service. The Navy had no need for thousands of fighters designed for a war that was over. Most were scrapped, their aluminum melted down for peacetime uses. Some were sold as surplus, a few were preserved in museums, but the Wildcat's legacy extended far beyond its service life. The tactics developed by Wildcat pilots became doctrine for all American fighter pilots. The Thach Weave was taught to jet pilots in Korea and Vietnam. The emphasis on teamwork, mutual support, and using your aircraft's strengths, rather than trying to match the enemy's strengths, became fundamental principles of American fighter tactics. The industrial lessons learned producing the Wildcat informed American aircraft production for decades. The quality control procedures, the production techniques, the supply, chain management that allowed General Motors to build Wildcats under license were applied to post-war aircraft production. Most importantly, the Wildcat proved that American industry and American pilots could adapt and overcome even when facing technically superior enemies. This lesson, learned in the desperate days of 1942, gave American military planners confidence that even if the country was surprised, even if the enemy had better equipment, American innovation and industrial might could turn the tide. The men who flew Wildcats went on to become leaders in the post-war Navy and Marine Corps. Some remained in military service, their combat experience invaluable in training the next generation. Others returned to civilian life, carrying with them the knowledge that they had faced the worst the enemy could offer and had prevailed. Edward Butch O'Hare, the first Wildcat ace and the first naval aviator to receive the Medal of Honor, was killed in action in November 1943 while flying a night fighter mission from the carrier Enterprise. He was 29 years old. Chicago's O'Hare International Airport was named in his honor in 1949, ensuring that his name would be remembered by millions of travelers. John Thach, the inventor of the Thach Weave, rose to the rank of admiral and served until 1967. He commanded carriers, served on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations, and helped shape the Navy's post-war fighter tactics. He never forgot the lessons learned flying Wildcats against Zeros. Joe Foss, the Marine ace who shot down 26 Japanese aircraft flying Wildcats from Guadalcanal, became a brigadier general in the Air National Guard, served as governor of South Dakota, and was the first commissioner of the American Football League. He remained active in aviation and veterans' causes until his death in 2003 at age 87. Marion Carl, another Marine Wildcat ace, became a test pilot after the war and set numerous speed and altitude records. He was the first Marine to fly faster than sound and flew more than 260 different types of aircraft during his career. He retired as a Major General in 1973. These men, and hundreds of others like them, carried the lessons of Wildcat combat with them throughout their lives. They had learned that victory wasn't always about having the best equipment. Sometimes it was about making the most of what you had, about adapting to circumstances, about teamwork and determination. In the decades after World War II, aviation enthusiasts began seeking out surviving Wildcats. Many had been scrapped, but a few had survived in surprising places. Some had been sold to foreign air forces and were later returned to the United States. Some had been used as ground trainers at flight schools. A few had simply been abandoned at remote bases and forgotten. Today, approximately 15 Wildcats are in flying condition worldwide, maintained by museums, warbird organizations, and private collectors. These restored aircraft appear at air shows where crowds gather to watch them fly and hear the distinctive sound of their radial engines. Seeing a Wildcat fly is seeing history come alive. The aircraft that look so ungainly on the ground become graceful in the air, their stubby wings and powerful engine pulling them through the sky with authority. For those who know the history, watching a Wildcat fly is watching the aircraft that stopped the Japanese advance in the Pacific, that bought time for American industry to produce the weapons needed for victory. At the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, one of the finest aviation museums in the world, there's a gallery dedicated to the early Pacific War. In that gallery sits a beautifully restored F4F Wildcat in the colours of VMF 211, the squadron that defended Wake Island. Next to it are artefacts from the battle, pieces of wreckage, personal items belonging to the pilots, photographs of the Marines who fought there. On the wall is a quote from James Devereux, the Marine officer who commanded the defence of Wake Island. "Send us more Japs," he supposedly radioed when asked if he needed anything. The quote was actually invented by a war correspondent, but it captured the spirit of the Wake defenders. They hadn't given up. They hadn't surrendered without a fight. They had fought with everything they had, including 4 Wildcats, until there was nothing left to fight with. That spirit, that refusal to give up even when facing overwhelming odds, defines the Wildcat's story. The pilots who flew it didn't have the best aircraft in the sky. They knew it. The Wildcat was slower than the Zero, couldn't turn with it, couldn't climb with it. But they also knew that giving up wasn't an option. So they found ways to win. They developed new tactics. They exploited the Wildcat's advantages. They worked together, covering each other, using teamwork to overcome individual inferiority. And gradually, mission by mission, battle by battle, they turned the tide. The Wildcat wasn't supposed to be able to beat the Zero. On paper, it couldn't. But wars aren't fought on paper. They're fought in the sky by frightened young men who do their duty despite the odds. And in that environment, the Wildcat and its pilots proved that determination, training and sound tactics could overcome technical inferiority. By the time the last Wildcat was retired from service in 1945, it had compiled a combat record that would have seemed impossible in December 1941. Nearly 400 enemy aircraft destroyed, dozens of ships sunk or damaged, thousands of ground targets destroyed, and most importantly, it had held the line during America's darkest hours in the Pacific. When everything seemed lost, when the Japanese were advancing on all fronts, when defeat seemed possible, the Wildcat stood its ground. That's the true measure of the Wildcat's greatness, not its maximum speed or rate of climb or any other performance statistic, but the fact that when America needed it most, when the fate of the Pacific hung in the balance, the little fighter from Grumman was there, and it was enough. The F4F Wildcat entered history as an interim fighter, a stopgap until something better could be developed. It was never meant to be a great fighter, it was meant to be adequate. But adequate was exactly what America needed in 1942. Not a super weapon that would take years to develop and perfect, but a solid, reliable fighter that could be produced quickly, flown by pilots with limited training, and maintained under combat conditions. The Wildcat was all of those things, and in being merely adequate, in being solid and reliable rather than brilliant, it became exactly what was needed. The day the F4F Wildcat stood its ground against the Zero wasn't a single day. It was every day from Wake Island to Okinawa. It was every mission where a Wildcat pilot faced fear and did his job anyway. It was every engagement where sound tactics defeated superior performance. It was 4 years of continuous combat, of pilots and maintainers, and everyone in the support chain doing their jobs with professionalism and courage. The Wildcat won, not because it was better than the Zero, but because the men flying it refused to lose, and in the end that made all the difference.